Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next Jews of Color, Histories and Futures webinar. My name is Thomas Pegler-Kaplan, and I'm the Interim Director of the program in Jewish Studies here at CU Boulder in Colorado. On behalf of the program, of course, I would like to welcome all of you, wherever you are, as CFA invite to tonight's session. We, of course, are very excited that Professor Mehta, who will take over and introduce the session in just a minute, is here with us, as well as our distinguished guest, Whitman College's Professor Helen Kim. We're going to be starting with the program, as I said, in just a minute, entitled Funny You Don't Look Jewish, a conversation about Asian American Jewish experiences. It is brought to us by the very prestigious Henry Luce Foundation grant to CU, and we are very, very thankful to the foundation for their ongoing support. And that started really a broad academic undertaking led by Professor Mehta, and has really started to, as it was envisioned, to reshape also the program here at CU, and of course, rightfully so. So let me just say that you're in here for a great treat that evening, and let me briefly introduce my colleague, Professor Mehta, who will take over in just a second. She is the Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Jewish Studies here at CU. She's also the main principal investigator with the Luce Foundation, and that's important to stress too, soon she will be the returning director of the program at Jewish Studies here. So without further ado, Professor Mehta, the screen is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Pegler-Kaplan. I am so delighted to welcome Helen Kim to the University of Colorado Boulder virtual stage. Professor Kim is a professor of sociology at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and the author with Noah Leavitt of JewAsian, Race, Religion, and Identity for America's Newest Jews, which was published in 2016 by the University of Nebraska Press. Her scholarship has been profiled in the New York Times, on NPR, and in the Huffington Post. She is currently the Associate Dean for Faculty Development at Whitman and the Director of their first-year experience. In the past, she has served as their Interim Vice President for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion. Dean Kim is also an active member of the Association for Jewish Studies. She's a member of the Executive Committee, where she is currently the Vice President for Programming. Helen Kim is deeply committed to mentoring junior scholars, and I am so grateful to have benefited from her care and attention, and I am delighted to welcome her to join us this evening. Welcome, Helen Kim.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Dr. Mehta. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan. It is my great honor and pleasure to be with you, with all of you today, to do a little bit of reflection back, as well as looking forward with regards to the book that my partner and I, Noah Leavitt, wrote. It seems like simultaneously forever ago and just yesterday. So I'm really looking forward to our time together. I do have some slides that I'm going to share, so pardon me for a minute while I fidget with a couple of buttons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that we wrote, JewAsian. I'd like to do this in a few parts. The book came out, and actually the inception, the idea for the book came out a long, long time ago. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the context and the historical moment that Noah and I were in when we first thought about this project and writing the book. I'd then like to delve into the contours of the individuals we talked to. So we talked to both JewAsian couples as well as JewAsian adult kids. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what we found and hit home at just a few themes from our book in terms of our conversations with couples as well as adult kids. And then the last 2 points, what we wish we had done and what's next. Samira and I thought we could use those 2 prompts to have a conversation with each other, sort of a Q&A between her and me in advance of Q&A with all of you. So I'm really looking forward to having a little fun and talking with Samira about what we wish we had done and also what's next. Okay. So the why for us. The why actually really started with my relationship with Noah. Noah Leavitt and I met at the University of Chicago in 1997. We were young graduate students. Noah is a nice Jewish boy from Ithaca, New York. His lineage, his heritage is Latvian, Ukrainian by way of Trenton, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. I am a second generation child of Korean immigrants by way of the Bay Area in Northern California. And we met in the middle as graduate students at the University of Chicago in 1997. 1997 was also an important date, especially thinking about my relationship with Noah, which is an interracial relationship, because 1997 is 30 years after 1967, and 1967 is when the Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia overturned the illegality of interracial marriage in this country. So 30 years post Loving v. Virginia, in the landscape, in the neighborhood where Noah and I met, as well as walked all throughout the country, I think we were seeing one generation beyond Loving v. Virginia, the effect of that landmark case on the demographic makeup of our country, vis-a-vis interracial relationships, as well as children being born to couples who are interracial. So 1997 was an important year, I think, just in terms of my having met Noah, as well as the American demographic landscape during that time. Also on this slide is the date 2000. 2000 is important for us and our study because that is the first time that the US Census allowed individuals to choose one or more race on the race checkbox category. So again, just 3 years after 1997, the census allowed for individuals to identify with 2 or more races if they chose. So that was, I think, a really important part of the demographic landscape, again, of the United States in 2000. 2000 was also really important in terms of the conversation and the narrative, particularly within the American Jewish community around intermarriage. In 2000, there was something called the National Jewish Population Survey, which was studied. Every 10 years, there is an NJPS survey that is taken that looks at, again, sort of a slice of demographics of the American Jewish population. And what the 2000 NJPS, as well as the 1990 NJPS, found and really focused on were rates of intermarriage in the American Jewish community, which were increasing and continue to increase beyond 2000. And the effect of those studies on the communal narrative, at least in terms of what Noah and I were hearing at the time, was intermarriage is increasing, and intermarriage over time spells the erosion of the Jewish people in the United States. And as Noah and I were becoming more and more serious in terms of our relationship and thinking about becoming life partners and having a family together, as we were hearing this narrative being circulated, we became really curious about this because we felt as though it wasn't really reflecting kind of our thinking about the possibilities that we were actually seeing for us to sustain not only Judaism and Jewish identity within our own lives, but also as we were talking to other people about this possibility. So we were really seeing a disconnect between what it is that we were hearing in the American Jewish community around intermarriage and what it is that we felt that we were experiencing and thinking about. So 2000 was also a time when I was really kind of in the nascent stages of being an academic and thinking about my own research trajectory and what it is that I was interested in studying. I became a professor, assistant professor of sociology at Whitman College in 2005. And as Noah and I were carving out our life in Walla Walla, and as I was thinking about what it is that I wanted to do with my life as a teacher scholar, I became more and more curious about the possibilities and the gaps that I felt that I was seeing in the Jewish sociology, in the Jewish social science, with regards to families that were mixed to some degree, not only intermarried families along the lines of religion, but also families that were mixed along other dimensions, such as race and ethnicity. So I really started to kind of dig in the literature to see what the literature was saying beyond the narrative that I was hearing around intermarriage, sort of spelling the death of the Jewish people. I really started digging. I started asking questions of people at places like the Cohen Center, at Brandeis University, at the University of Miami, at the University of Connecticut. Talk to me about the kind of information that you are collecting on the American Jewish population, especially that looks at race. And the response that I often got back was, we're doing a little bit of that, or we're not really doing a lot of that. There's more to be done, and we're not doing that. You should really talk to Gary Tobin. Gary Tobin is a prominent Jewish demographer who ran the Cohen Center at Brandeis. And for a variety of reasons, left the Cohen Center and started his own think tank out in San Francisco, California, called the Institute for Community Jewish Research. And an arm of that think tank was called the Holashon, in every tongue. And through a series of conversations with Gary Tobin and his wife, Diane, Noah and I really decided to sort of launch a qualitative project that looked at mixed families, mixed along dimensions of religion, race, and ethnicity, where we started with partners where one of the partners was Jewish of any race or ethnicity, and the other partner was racially Asian of any religion or ethnicity, to try to understand beyond survey statistics how it is that partners were thinking about navigating and negotiating their respective identities in the context of a life partnership as well as a marriage. So this last little line on numbers and words, it really speaks to Noah's and my intention and desire to really kind of understand and dig deep through qualitative research to understand how it is that couples were navigating their various identities as they were thinking about their marriages as well as their family lives. Okay, so we ended up talking to roughly 34 couples in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Los Angeles and Orange County area, as well as the New York metropolitan area and the Philadelphia area. We talked to 34 couples, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings. In addition, we also talked to, eventually, to millennial adult children who were born to couples like those that we had interviewed. So I'll also go into some of the findings with regards to these adult children. So as I mentioned, we were really interested in understanding how it is that couples were navigating a variety of things, a variety of identities in the context of their partnerships as well as their families. And one of the things that we were wondering about is how it is that the differences on paper might be sources of tension or might be sources of connection. So we asked couples to really to talk to us about that. And by and large, we found from our couples that there was a huge emphasis on what they felt was a set of shared values between Jewish Americans as well as Asian Americans. And that those values, the similarities in those values, really seem to offset a lot of potential obstacles in their relationship, perceived or otherwise. So some of the values that they really focused on were values around hard work, values around educational achievement, values around close-knit families. Those were really the prominent ones that they talked about, again, as similarities that allowed them to connect to potentially offset obstacles. So that's, I would say, one key theme that couples really focused on as they talked about negotiating their various identities. Couples who also had kids, who were in the process of raising kids or who were contemplating raising kids, talked a lot about how it is that they were creating homes that were a combination and an honoring of all of their identities, including their Jewish identities as well as their Asian American identities. And I would say what was really striking to us when we talked to couples about their home lives with their children, I think what we were expecting, in part because of the narrative in the American Jewish community at the time, was a little bit more of a doom and gloom scenario. But what we found with the couples who we interviewed was that there were really, really, really high levels, particularly of Jewish engagement and consistent Jewish religious practice. So what does that mean? These were couples who talked about regular attendance at synagogues, regular holiday observance, a regular table practice, observance of holidays and rituals such as Passover, the high holidays, having a bris, having a bar bat mitzvah. We were really, really struck by the extent and I would say enthusiasm and regularity with which couples were creating homes with very, very high levels of Jewish engagement. So to kind of maybe talk a little bit more about some of the findings in terms of some specific quotes from couples, I thought maybe these two might be some good starting points to sort of illustrate some of the things that the couples talked about, especially in terms of a sense of shared family values and how it is that those family values emanated in the home. So the first one is, and I'll read these. One individual said, I'm not sure exactly when I started to realize when she, the partner, was Jewish. Somewhere along the line, I just knew that she did a lot with her family. I think at the very beginning of the stages, at least for us, it had nothing to do with family values, but was as we got closer, as we figured out if one another would be good life partners, I think that did come into play. So I think a stress on family values as a connecting point with this partner sort of at the beginning of their relationship. The second quote, I think my personal experience is that both Jewish and Chinese value systems are very compatible. I wasn't really ever concerned about how we wanted to raise our kids and teaching them right and wrong. Learning to respect others, just from growing up from my peers, I was pretty confident that that wouldn't be an area of conflict. So again, I think this perceived connection between, in this example, Jewish and Chinese value systems as a way of maybe offsetting some potential obstacles. I would say this was a very common type of quote that illustrates this real connection to what we're thought about as compatible values. Okay, so after we interviewed our 34 couples, the question that always came up was, well, what about the kids? You know, that's great that you're talking about the couples, but really what I care about is what's going to happen with the kids. So we did end up interviewing approximately 40, again, millennial adult children born to couples like those that we interviewed. And I would say that from our conversations with the adult kids, there were three main themes that really, really emerged. Again, around this question of how it is that JewAsian kids were negotiating and thinking about all of their respective identities in one person. So the first thing that really came through as we talked to adult kids was that they really, really, really saw themselves first and foremost as multiracial individuals. And if we think back to the date of 2000, we interviewed adult kids in the 2000 teens-ish. So about 10 years after the 2000 census first allowed for individuals to check more than one race box. So that makes a lot of sense. These were really individuals who saw themselves as multiracial, really, I think, affirmed their identities as multiracial. They were very, very, very much first and foremost multiracial individuals. At the same time, these were also adult kids who very clearly affirmed being both Jewish as well as Asian. There was a lot of strength and attachment to who it is that they were and are as Jews, a very, very, very strong sense of Jewish identity, as well as a strong sense of Asian identity. And I think that was a testament to a lot of the similar kinds of things that we saw in terms of the couples and what it is that they did in the context of their family to bring in Jewish identity as well as Asian identity into the home. We saw that play out with this separate sample of adult children that we talked to. So again, sort of a very strong sense of Jewish identity as well as Asian identity. So having said that, individuals also talk to us about feeling like they belonged in Jewish spaces in particular, at the same time that they also felt like they didn't belong. And I really want to emphasize that these were individuals who held both at the same time, sort of a sense of belonging, but also a sense of not belonging, particularly in Jewish spaces, all while they were affirming and talking about a very, very, very strong sense of Jewish identity. And so I'd like to go into that a tiny bit with some quotes. And this relates to the title of the talk, Funny, You Don't Look Jewish. So I'm gonna talk about 3 quotes in particular that I think get at that sense of belonging as well as not belonging. So the first one is, a lot of people think I'm Mexican when they first meet me. Most people just assume that I'm not Jewish, and they can tell right off the bat that I'm somewhat Asian or something ethnic. So they're always shocked when they find out I'm Jewish, which to me feels really weird because I feel so much stronger about my Jewish identity than my Asian identity. So that's always kind of a weird balance. So I think this quote in particular really starts to get at the richness and complexity, especially along the lines of racialized assumptions of what Jews in the United States are supposed to look like, and how it is that those assumptions play out in terms of this person's individual interactions, both in Jewish spaces as well as non-Jewish spaces. So that's just a quote to kind of think about and stew on a little bit. The other 2 quotes, how is that possible that you are Jewish, or you mean that you're half Jewish? I would say that these are examples amongst many, many, many examples of what I would call microaggressions. So these little jabs that are constant doubts or questions that individuals, both in Jewish spaces and non-Jewish spaces, say and said to our adult participants that really challenged and negated who it is that they were as Jews. These happened all the time, and I think they felt like at times death by 1,000 cuts. And so what was interesting to us, recognizing that these kinds of microaggression comments were so common, is by and large, the way that our adult children responded to them was actually to take advantage of those comments and display who it is that they were as Jews with, I would say, more strength and more force. There is, I think, amongst a lot of folks, this idea of saying, well, if you're going to challenge me for being Jewish, I'm just going to kind of turn that back at you and stick it to you and, school you in Torah to sort of show you that I'm just as Jewish as you are. And so that was really, really, I think, a little surprising to us, because I think we expected much more of the sort of death by 1,000 cuts to result in a kind of a pushing away or a shying away from one sense of Jewish identity. And by and large, that is actually not what we thought. So it was a really, really interesting, I think, reaction that we had. Okay. So as I said at the beginning, I think I have a lot of thoughts about things that I wish that I had asked, that Noah and I had asked. And so maybe I would like to invite Samira to come back to perhaps talk about and engage with me in a conversation, and an invitation to do a little bit of reflecting back, and also to talk about perhaps some next steps.
Thank you so much. Before we dive into the conversation, I both want to thank you for your remarks, and I want to give folks a little bit of just a little quick set of instructions about the Q&A and kind of give you a little roadmap. So Helen and I are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions and answers from all of you. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is something labeled Q&A, and you can put your questions in there. When you put your question in, let me know if you would like me to share your name with everybody, or if there's something about you that you would like me to particularly share. I'm hoping we'll be able to get to all of them. You might notice that I'll also sort of, if two people ask really similar things, right, I might put those questions together or something like that. But please get that going, drop lots of questions in, and we will get there in just a little bit. But I wanted to start sort of to take you up on the invitation that you offered to ask, this book has been out for 8 years now. And in the time frame that you gave us, you really started thinking about it 20 years before it was published, basically. Yeah. If you take a start date of 1997 for this 2016 book, what would you do differently now? Or what do you think you would find differently, right? Like, even if you did everything exactly the same, it's a different historical moment. So what would you do differently? What do you think you would find? And how much of that, like, how much of those differences are tied to you as a sort of person who has changed and grown over the almost 30 years since you started the project? And how much of that do you think is about the way that society has changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. There's a lot I would do differently. So maybe to back up and talk a little bit about how it is that we got to the 34 individuals. Again, I talked about working with Gary Tobin at Bohol and working with their networks. So their networks were largely, Jewish entities, Jewish communal organizations, synagogues, et cetera, in urban areas. And that was great, because that is where we are likely to see the highest rates of, and again, I'll use the term intermarriage for our purposes today, and intermarriage of mixed race, interracial marriages. And, we know there are Jews and Asians and Jews and Asians in lots of other kinds of communities. I'm thinking of Springfield, Illinois, where Noah and I lived. Not exactly an urban metropolis, smaller type of place. What would it look like to think about navigating and negotiating one's identities in the context of a marriage and growing a family in a place like that? versus say, oh gosh, Brunswick, Maine, for example, or Walla Walla, Washington. So I say that to say, I wish that we had interviewed more couples in a variety of different kinds of geographic spaces. Because I think we might find different things because those contexts are different, and the kinds of resources to do Jewish identity and do Asian identity, for lack of a better phrasing, are likely going to be different. So that's one thing. I didn't go into the contours of the ethnic identities and the affiliations, in terms of movement of our couples. So what I can say is we had everything from unaffiliated to modern Orthodox in terms of the Jewish identity with regards to affiliation. And then for the Asian ethnic identity, we had the most popular was Chinese American, Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, Thai, Indian. We did not have good representation amongst Southeast Asians. And so I say that to say, I wish we had maybe broadened our ethnic diversity, especially for the Asians, the Asian partner. And relatedly, one question that we often get is, what is the socioeconomic, profile of the couples that we interviewed? We didn't ask for the socioeconomic specifics, but again, these were mostly very well-educated professional couples. These were couples that had resources. So I think what I'm saying is, I wonder if we had gotten more of a representation of couples who were broader in terms of ethnic diversity as well as socioeconomic diversity. I wonder how the question, how do you navigate your various identities, might have looked differently with a broader, more diverse sample along those lines. My gut sense is to say access to resources, and then therefore perhaps the ways in which Jewish identity and Asian identity played out in a family as well as for adult kids might not have looked as strong. So maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, the time that the sort of broader conversations around race and identity, particularly in the Jewish world, I don't know that there are notably stronger conversations now than there were in the late 90s, but they're really different. And so I'm wondering how you think that if you were to talk to, for instance, a population now, I know you're going to be doing interviews with the Lunar Collective. And so, how do you think, what is your hunch for how that will be different? Maybe say a little bit about who they are as well for context.
Sure. Yeah. The Lunar Collective, oh gosh, it brings a smile to my face. The Lunar Collective is a collective of Asian American Jews. It's a collective of Asian American Jews who come together virtually to be in community with one another. And being in community looks like celebration of Jewish holidays and Asian holidays and Jewish rituals and Asian rituals. They do that virtually. They do that in person in various locations, Los Angeles and New York in particular. And it's sort of a for us, by us organization that started really when an Asian American Jew named Jen Schlossberg kind of found another Asian American Jew, Jenny Rudolph, and they found each other sort of through stories that were shared on the internet, and they got together and they're like, oh my gosh, we should like get together and basically share stories. It has really blossomed and bloomed into just this really rich community that actually now is doing performances, telling stories in a variety of ways, including performances, lots of different kinds of multimedia expressions. So talking to that group, and that group is largely, it skews younger. I'd say predominantly individuals in their 20s and early 20s to late 20s, a few kind of in their 30s as well. So these are the Gen Z folks. I would say identity for them is different. It's fluid, it's mixed, it's, duality, triality. It's like it's not black and white by any stretch of the imagination. It's not either one or the other. It's everything. And so I could imagine that the conversations around identity, if I were to interview them as maybe the adult kids, that there would be a lot more nuance that they would talk about. And I think for me, maybe given how I've matured as well as a scholar, greater attention on my part to the nuances as well. And I think a desire to make sure that those merge and those are brought out. I'd say it's also a population, especially with regards to religious identity, that may not necessarily see Jewish religious identity as in opposition to another religious identity. So one of the current co-directors, Mariam Chishti, she calls herself a Musjew. So she's Muslim and Jewish. And those are not competing. They are her. And I think there are many other individuals in Lunar who are very like-minded and experience their identities in that way.
So that really sets up the next thing that I wanted to ask. And this is something you and I have talked about at other times because you come from the discipline of sociology and I come from the discipline of religious studies. I was really struck when I read your book, and then again when I listened to you talk today, about the sort of the category of Jewish and the category of Asian. And Jewish is, of course, this really complicated ethno-religious identity that sometimes had racial overtones and often has ethnic overtones. And you can be Jewish while being an atheist and all sorts of things like that. And there's massive diversity, of course, in how people experience their Jewishness, but there's arguably even more diversity in Asian religiosity, where there are, first of all, you talked about a really broad swath of the world in Asia. So automatically you've got East, South, and Southeast Asians. So you've got Hindus, you've got people who are from sort of Buddhist or Shinto or Confucian cultures. There are Muslim cultures. There are really sort of a wide array of experiences of Christianity, some of which are really old, some of which are products of more recent missionary encounters. And so I'm interested in the question of how, when you talked about sort of Jewish rituals and Asian rituals, How were those held together? How did people think about the religions that the Asian sides of their family brought to the table? And did it matter what religion it was, too?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the last question. I think by and large, it did not matter what religion it was. So in our sample of couples, we had, if there was a religious identification with the non-Jewish partner, it was, the most popular one was Christianity. We had some Buddhists, we had some Hindus. We didn't have any Muslims. For the Christians, I would say the strength of the Christian practice for the individual in the couple who self-identified as Christian was not so strong as to be seen and experienced as in conflict with the religious identity and the subsequent practice or passing down of Jewish practice religiously. It was not talked about as in conflict. It was not talked about as felt as in conflict. And so I would describe it was not so strong as to be seen as in competition. And I would say the other religions, namely Buddhism and Hinduism, also were not as well. And so I think that speaks to maybe a deficiency, kind of to your first question, what would I do differently? And maybe to go back to that, anecdotally, I know, and, sociologically, it's got to be the case that there are marriages where, let's say Christian, the strength of the Christian practice or identity is kind of seen in competition or in opposition to the Jewish practice and identity. And so we did not have that in our sample. And I would imagine that if we had more couples like that, that there might be some moments of tension that we did not see in our couples, particularly around how to incorporate those, if that was a point of discussion, or maybe how not to incorporate one versus the other.
Excellent. I'm going to ask one question, and then we're going to turn to questions from the audience. My last question for me is a question around, this was really a project that started with interracial, perhaps interfaith marriages. Lots of Asian Jews or JewAsians come from other kind of modes of entering Judaism. I'm thinking in particular of adoption. There was, again, kind of in the late 90s in particular, a large number of girls adopted from China into the United States, and Jewish families adopted disproportionately high numbers compared to sort of the rest of the American population. And so I'm curious as to whether you encountered any of those folks, or if you have thoughts about how that experience, I can think of lots of ways that it would be different, but did you hear about any of that in your work?
We did not. Our colleague Jenny Sartori had started a project that I really wish one day would be a book. We did not have anybody in our sample who was adopted. It's certainly a question that we get all the time. What about adopted children? I think what I might imagine would be the case thinking about adult kids who, let's say, are adoptees from China, being adopted by Jewish parents who are racially completely different from them. I might imagine that their negotiations and how it is they think about their racial identity might have a different kind of nuance than how it is that the individuals who we talked to, who are the adult kids, talked about their racial identities. Again, these were multiracial individuals. So I think that would be an interesting point of comparison, particularly around race. It looks like you're going to say something. So
I was going to say, shall we turn to the questions from the audience?
Sure. Yeah.
So a lot of the questions that we have are coming from sort of outside of the context of the person or the family or the immediate family. So we have a question. I would be interested in hearing more about family responses more broadly, grandparents and others, for example, and how they helped or hindered in supporting couples and families.
Yes, that's a great question. We did ask for, so an example of a question that hopefully speaks to this question. We asked couples to talk about, how did your family react to your relationship and the possibility of your marriage and raising a family? There was some variation. I would say there were some couples who said things like, oh, my parents and my family, they were super accepting. And then there were couples who talked about something different. My mom really had an issue with me dating a Chinese man, for example. So, as we sort of dug to try to understand a little bit more about what specifically the issue was, the conversations were really around differences in communication styles, I would say. So this idea that there was a tension, and there was a tension with a spouse, or maybe a future spouse especially, who was, quote, of a different identity, most often was around, how am I going to communicate with this person? I have a different communication style. I mean, to maybe give an illustrative example, I'm really chatty and your partner is not. How are we going to get along? And over time, it was the case as the parent got to know the future spouse or spouse, those tensions started to get worked on, and I wouldn't say that they faded away and disappeared, but they were points of significant work. If I could I just expand on that a little bit? I'll say one of the things that we expected to hear much more is like about racism. Like, my parent doesn't like my spouse and they're racist. We were expecting to hear that, and we didn't really hear that in our interviews. We launched our book with a talk at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And our talk was to a crowd that was largely older, I would say folks in their 60s to their 80s, who came. I would say they presented as white, and I would say that they very likely were white and Jewish. And there was one individual, a man who looked to be in his 80s, who from the audience said, I'm really curious to know if anybody in the room who might have a child who's like one of the spouses that Helen and Noah interviewed, like what your experiences have been. And he went on to say, my daughter is dating a Asian American man. And he said in front of everybody, like, and I'm really having a tough time with the race thing. So, he was basically saying, like, I've got some racism in me, and it's really coming to a head. He even said, like, I'm actually in therapy about this. So, everybody was kind of really listening to him. And as Noah and I were listening to him, I think what we were thinking is, what if we had interviewed 500 more couples? We probably would have encountered a parent or a grandparent like this person who, was explicitly saying that, yes, the fact that this is a mixed marriage along race is presenting some issues for me.
So moving even beyond the extended family into the Jewish world, this is a question from Julie Carr at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Do you think there's a shift in how the larger Jewish community or institutions feel about intermarriage now? Another way of asking this, what level of anxiety about the waning of Jewish identity is still operating in these institutions in the US? And I might add to that, does the Asian Jewish example complicate that or not, right? Like, is it a slightly different story when there's the racial difference layered on?
Yeah, I would say if I could say the concern, the narrative, I would maybe even use just my memory as sort of the hysteria around intermarriage back in 2000 and prior. It feels as though it is not in that place. And I think that is a testament to, oh gosh, a lot of work and proactive work, especially that the reform movement has done. And also, I think a lot of really good social science scholarship that has been done that uses data to say, actually, engagement and identity are not going away with intermarriage. And intermarriage is that's just part of the demographic landscape for the American Jewish community. With regards to, I'm sorry, Samira, can you rephrase the question around the racial variation, just so I'm sure that I.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways you did answer it, that the sort of tenor of the conversation has changed. I was going to ask whether you thought that adding a racial identity, and we're talking about Asianness, although I think this is a question I would imagine it might be even more striking in white, Jewish, Black marriages, but whether sort of the question of racial difference heightened any of those feelings or anxieties.
Yeah.
One of the things I found in my research was that, for instance, interfaith, interracial families were, because nobody thought that those families were going to produce children who could seamlessly pass in the Jewish world as not being the children of interfaith families, which obviously there are lots of Jews of color. They could be from entirely Jewish families, but nobody is thinking when it's an interfaith, interracial marriage, nobody's thinking, oh, if we do this right, no one will ever know. And so they got a little bit more permission to include in that sort of peak hysteria time, right, when there was this desire for a really purely Jewish home, they got more permission to add from the other culture. Now, in trade, they also experienced a lot more racism. But there was a little bit more flexibility than their white interfaith family counterparts.
Got it. Yeah. I think where I go to is, the work that you're doing, Samira, the Jews of Color Initiative that put out the Beyond the Count study. Beyond the Count is a study that actually takes the work that Samira has done and others have done to kind of look at some of the population numbers, like amongst Jews of color, as well as it does a really good job of, I think, meshing quantitative and qualitative data to kind of understand Jews of color in the United States. Oh gosh, I think of other Jewish communal organizations in addition to Lunar, such as Jews in All Hues and Jutina. I think we are in a moment where representation of Jews of color looks very different. I'm kind of shocked that it's changed so much in what feels like such a short period of time, that I've got to believe that with regards to the racial variation, that with such a visible increase in representation, that it may not be the kind of hysteria that we might have experienced 10 years ago. That's not to say that everything's peachy keen, for sure. But I am heartened and cautiously optimistic that we are seeing in a lot of different ways Jews of color being represented, and represented in a lot of different ways, and their stories being told. So that gives me a lot of hope.
So we've got two questions that I'm going to kind of combine in asking a final question, because they both sort of tie to Jewish ethnic identity. And one person sort of says for Jews whose sense of Jewishness goes back for dozens of generations, there's this real sense of persecution that is fundamental to Jewish identity, maybe more than a relationship to Torah or a relationship to the Seder or any other Jewish ritual. So like a history of Jews as a people rather than a set of religious beliefs, and a persecuted people at that. And so that question is asking sort of, how do the people that you've studied relate to that? Is that part of their story? Is it not? I might add to that, like, is that part of their Jewish story? How does that come in or not come in their Asian stories? And I'm both thinking about histories of Asian discrimination and exclusion in the United States. And I'm also thinking about Asian immigrants who sort of need to have a narrative that they've come to give their kids a better life, and therefore within a generation, right, they're not thinking of they're not wanting to think of their kids as racialized minorities. So sort of both of those tensions. So how does that function Jewishly? How does that function Asianly?
Yeah.
And somebody else sort of, again, thinking about identity, is wondering about people who are not thinking about being Jewish as a religious identity, but rather as an ethnic identity. And so they think of themselves as being half Jewish and half, I don't know, Korean, Japanese American, whatever the other thing is. And so you're thinking about, matzo ball soup and I don't know, udon rather than I'm
Sure.
like frozen soup, right? Rather than belief systems. So this
Yeah,
peoplehood question in both of those.
sure. Um, um, that's a lot, and I just want to be sure that I answer all of the questions correctly. So I'm going to go to the being Jewish or being Asian as being part of the people that has a history of persecution, and whether or not that how that entered into our conversations. I would say that it did, and it's not that it didn't. We asked questions around, experiences of anti-Semitism, experiences in terms of family history with exclusion, both in terms of Jewish identity as well as Asian ethnic identity. I would say that those narratives and a connection to a people that has the peoples that have histories of persecution were there. As I'm reflecting back on our conversations, they were there, but they were aspects of who it is that they were that I think kind of took a back seat to thinking about themselves as Jews and Asians as part of the people in different ways. And the question for me is then why? Because one could imagine a scenario where that sense of identity, an attachment to people with histories of persecution would be a lot stronger. And perhaps this speaks to the historical context at the time around how it is that Jews and Asians, I would say, generally were seen. So for those of you who maybe follow the Pew studies, there's a lot of Pew studies, and they take the temperature of like Jewish Americans, like what does it mean to be Jewish American? What does it mean to be Asian American? At the time, Jews were like the cool group. They were like the group, the religious group that was like really cool and there was a lot of positive thought, at least that the Pew studies were saying around perceptions of Jews. There's a lot of positive associations with Jews, which I wonder, given that moment in time, if that might have had an influence into how it is that the Jews that we interviewed as part of our project might have then thought about all of the different connections with identity, in terms of religious practice or ethnic practice, or belonging to people that had a history of persecution. Also around the same time, there was a study called The Rise of Asian Americans, which for some people was looked at as like, oh, here we are again, like, yay, we're the model minority in the same way that actually Jews have always been, positioned. So I think there were a lot of reactions that were positive to that. I myself have my own critique of that. I did not like that framing. So I wondered if that might have had some kind of impact that trickled down into how it is that folks that we looked at sort of hung on to what I would say are the more, quote, positive aspects of their identity, and less so the doom and gloom aspects of their identity. So
I said that was the last question, but someone has called my attention to questions that landed in the chat rather than in the
Okay.
Q&A.
Okay.
So on the subject of doom and gloom, we have a question asking, two questions from the same person asking. One is, are there couples who chose to marry but not to have kids because of concerns about having mixed race kids and or raising mixed race kids in Judaism? I don't know if you talked to childless couples.
We did.
And the other question is, how much racism comes from Jews towards these kids? And the person who asked that question brought up both the book, The Color of Love, and some of the things that Mara Gad, who is a Black Jewish woman, both writes about in that book, including racism within her own family. So she says, I'm thinking about the book, The Color of Love, and how Mara Gad was treated. And I will note, I'm not sure whether the person asking the question means Mara Gad writes in that book about experiences of racism at the hands of other Jews, but also has spoken really compellingly about, for instance, being invited to speak in large Jewish settings, like to the entire Reform movement, and being there as an invited speaker and experiencing racism in those settings. So it could be the racism in Mara Gad's book. It could be the racism that Mara Gad has experienced as a public Jewish figure.
Yes.
So what kinds of stories of racism are coming up?
Sure. Yeah. So again, for the adult kids who I would say experience, many examples of microaggressions, I think for them, those were experiences of racism. The constant questioning, they were statements said so frequently in Jewish spaces that were basically like, because of what it is that you look like, I think you don't belong here. And at the same time, if I'm sort of, I'm going to riff off of the Color of Love book. At the same time, and actually what this study Beyond the Count found, that the Jews of Color Initiative put out, is like, yes, you can have Jews of color have these yucky experiences, either microaggressions or macroaggressions in Jewish spaces, and yet they also can feel attachment and connection and a sense of belonging. Those can exist at the same time. And I think, if I go back to what it is I was saying in terms of people's responses to say, like, I'm going to like school you with my Torah. We sort of saw it as like, there's something about Judaism, Jewish identity, Jewish community, even in spite of the kinds of consistent cuts that they experience, that still draws them in. And to the point where they didn't want to just abandon everything. They wanted to stick with it. And there are various ways in which they talked about sticking with it. And one of them was actually to stick it to people. But it's, to continue to want to be engaged. So that's sort of one thought. The couples who chose not to have children because of the mix, no, we did not find anybody who said, I'm not going to have kids because of fear rooted in that. I think it was more of I just don't want to have kids, period. I'm not interested in having kids. I don't want to add to the population. It was not something where we heard other reasons than that.
Okay, it was sort of the standard reasons that people who don't have
standard reasons, yeah. It wasn't the like, I'm gonna, scar them because we're in the kind of relationship we're in.
Right. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you for doing it over Zoom, which is both less work and less travel and less fun because we don't take you out to dinner.
Yeah.
But although we will have to do that at some point. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you as well to those of you who are here listening. Programs like this only work when there's an audience, and of course, thank you to the people and organizations who have made this possible. There would be no Jews of Color History and Futures project without the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation. There would be no ability to run a program like this without the CU Boulder program in Jewish Studies, my colleagues Thomas Pegalo Kaplan, Felicia Martinez, and Maggie Rosenau, who have put a huge amount of work into making this happen. The David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts. I accidentally forgot to ask Dan how to pronounce his last name again, but I believe it's Shasted, Dan Shasted, of Third Harmonic Live Productions, who has produced this event for us tonight, Danya Rivlin and Eyal Rivlin, whose music you heard at the very beginning. And I just, again, want to thank all of those folks. I've already said both Felicia and Maggie's names, but again, without them, there would be no program in Jewish Studies. And so thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you to all of the funders and people whose labor have made this event possible. And of course, thank you to our guest, Professor Helen Kim of Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Thank you.
Samira, you are a real trailblazer and vanguard. I'm really honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.